All right, guys, so previously I did a bit of a exercise assessment on Bulgarian split squats, and I am planning to make more of those. We're going to make a bit of a playlist out of it, but I thought it might be useful to sort of explain the process of how to do an exercise assessment so that you guys can do it on the fly. So I had a list of a few different exercises I was thinking of doing. But this one we're not pre-preparing. We're going to pick one of those, but it's not one that I've thought through yet. So you can see the process of how you would do this kind of assessment. Obviously, if you're in the gym picking an exercise quickly, you'd want to do a faster version of this. But you know, if you're the kind of person who sits around thinking about your training a lot, maybe spend some of that time doing this. So today we're going to do an exercise assessment on cable donkey kicks, which if you don't know, or if you call them something else, that's fine. It's that exercise, usually ladies do them, but it is a decent exercise for anyone to do, where you put the cable down the bottom of the cable machine, you get the ankle cuff thing, you put it around your ankle, and you kick your leg up behind you. So glute exercise, we're gonna do an assessment on one of those. So the first thing we're gonna look at is what are the factors of analysis? What are the things that we care about when we analyze an exercise? There's a few fitness qualities. Now, if you guys remember PE class, you would have heard of the different fitness qualities before. The ones we're going to talk about are strength, hypertrophy, athleticism, and mobility or rehab. We're kind of putting those together. And then cardio, and then I normally have another category for just other. Now, there are actually more qualities than this, so why is it these ones? I think they're the most relevant for most people's exercises and goals, and they also adequately cover other qualities. They're sort of like umbrella concepts. So for example, mobility would include flexibility. There is a point where they split off from each other, and you know, to get really, really flexible, you have to focus on flexibility more than just mobility. But to the degree that most people want and need to be flexible, mobility itself is totally adequate. Similarly, athleticism includes power and speed and agility. We're sort of talking about all of those. They're all different factors, but you can easily summarize them all with the concept of athleticism. Similarly, body composition is its own fitness quality, but since that mostly just comes down to how much muscle you have and then how lean you are, we're just going to include that in hypertrophy. So, there's a few other examples, but that's why we've picked these ones. They pretty much cover everything. The other category covers relevant issues that don't fit into other categories, obviously. So that might be things like injury risk, or it's sort of an on-the-fly assessment there. So we're going to analyze cable donkey kick backs from a strength perspective. The first thing we want to look at for strength is overload, because obviously when you're getting stronger, that means lifting more weights primarily. Sometimes it means reps, that sort of thing. It's all relevant, but the primary factor is how heavy it is. And the donkey cable kickback, whatever I call it, cable donkey kicks or kickback, not very good for overload. Just the position you're in, the setup it uses. Maybe if you had some kind of special machine for these. I have actually seen kickback machines that are designed in such a way you sort of strap in, grab onto some handles, and you could push some pretty heavy weight with those. So that would be good for overload, but the standard cable kickback thing, not very good for overload, just really hard to do, so not ideal. On that note, an important factor in overload is instability. When it comes to strength training, and especially the overload aspect of strength training, instability is almost always a negative. Now, the cable donkey kick, it's not the most unstable exercise in the world. You're not very likely to fall over, but if you try loading up a lot of weight on one of these things, you're going to have a hard time balancing while you move the weight. That's part of what makes it a difficult exercise to overload. So instability is generally a negative there. The next thing you want to look at is progression potential. This matters because while an exercise can be good for strength if it's heavy, if it's really hard to add weight to it over time, how are you going to get any better? At the same time, if it starts really light, that's also not a problem. Maybe the overload at first is not the best, but if the progression potential is good, you can add weight over time, you can get stronger, and that's really what we're looking for here. So ways to check progression potential. There's a lot of factors involved in this. Sometimes with machines, like they just don't actually go that high. Some cable stacks are weirdly small, so whatever exercise you would be doing on that cable stack doesn't have good progression potential. If you went to another gym with a better cable machine, maybe it would be okay, but in that circumstance, it's just not very good. It's not very good for strength. That's not so much an issue with the exercise though, as it is the equipment, and they're not always intrinsically linked, but you got to consider it. Now, the progression potential on cable kickbacks or donkey kicks, it's okay. It's not too bad, but it's not as good as it could be. And one of the main reasons for that is because it doesn't use that many muscles. An isolation exercise only uses one muscle and maybe some smaller ones that connect to it or some adjacent muscles. The cable kickback primarily trains the glutes, which are a very strong muscle. Even if they're not strong right now, they can grow quite a lot and get a lot stronger. So maybe, at first you'll be kind of weak, and over time you can slowly add kilos and just get stronger and stronger. But if you imagine, your day one training weight with cable kickbacks versus your potential 1RM, like imagine you've been doing cable kickbacks for like 5 years and you want to go max out the heaviest possible cable kickback you can do. It's probably not that far ahead of whatever you did on your first day. So that means that the progression potential is not ideal. Doesn't mean it's a terrible exercise, but this aspect of strength, it's not doing super well. So the last thing you want to look at for strength training, last of the main parts, is how this exercise carries over to strength sports or real life activities. Now, in the athleticism section, we have a discussion of carrying over to other sports, but obviously the most important thing in strength sports is how strong you are. So it goes in the strength category. And for real life activities, that's things like moving furniture, or I don't know, picking your kids up off the ground or something. Strength is probably the most important factor. There's others, mobility matters a little bit, but for the most part, it's like, if you're gonna hurt your back picking your kid up off the ground, it's because your back was too weak. So strength is the primary consideration there. Now, the carryover of the cable kickback to strength sports is not very high. There's basically no movement in any strength sport that looks like a cable kickback that's directly related to it. It's like a one-legged hip extension. So I guess deadlifts are a hip extension. If you're a power lifter, these might help a little bit, but probably not. You'd be better off doing something that's more like a deadlift. Similarly with squats. So not the best carryover. As for real life activities, man, I really can't think of many real life actions that look like doing a cable kickback. Yeah, I'm struggling. If you can think of one, let me know, make a little comment. I'm struggling to think of one. So carry over to strength sports and real life activities, not the best. So overall for strength, cable donkey kicks, not a very good option. Okay, next up, we're gonna look at their relevance to hypertrophy. So hypertrophy has a few more factors involved. The first one is which muscles are targeted. And this is not so much, it's not like more muscles are better, less muscles are worse, or the other way around. You have to consider the other parts, like the range of motion, the stimulus, all that sort of thing, but you want to know at least what muscles you're working. And like I said earlier, for the cable kickback, primarily the glutes. You will get a little bit of stimulus in other areas, maybe the hamstrings, maybe the quads, depending on the exact form you're using, maybe your lower back, your stabilizer muscles, depending on how you're set up. But by far the main muscle, to the degree where it's basically an isolation exercise, is the glutes. That's not really a pro or a con. You just want to know which ones you're working. You should know that with every exercise. What is it doing? Why are you doing this? The next thing is the range of motion. And I would say for glute kickbacks, they're actually pretty good. They're probably one of the best range of motion exercises for the glutes. You can do them at a few different angles if you want, which allows even more range of motion for more functions and more different parts of the glutes. You can get a really good stretch on them, especially if you do a setup, maybe standing on top of something, you know, plate under your foot, something like that. So really good stretch and a really good contraction. You can swing your leg all the way around. So if you do the setup right, these can basically use the full function of your glutes. So that's really good. After that, we have a raw stimulus, just how hard they hit the muscle. And this one, there's almost sort of a spectrum to it, depending on how advanced you are and how strong you are. If you're very new to training, this might actually have a pretty good raw stimulus for you. If you've never really used your glutes for anything, you live a sedentary lifestyle, or you know, maybe you play a bit of sports, but they're just not very, you know, not much strength training, not that much stimulus to the glutes, you'll probably do these and you'll get sore glutes, you'll feel a good, you know, stimulus, and they'll grow pretty well. So the stimulus of these can be good. But if you are well trained, you've been doing squats, deadlifts, hip thrusts, anything else that uses the glutes for a while, and you've gotten even remotely strong at them, which you would hope so if you've been doing them for a while, the raw stimulus of this is pretty low. If you just consider the maximum weight you can do a kickback with, I don't know, maybe it's like 20 kilos or something. Maybe your best deadlift is like 140 kilos. And you know, the force vectors are a bit different for sure, but still, there is no way that a 20 kilo cable kickback is going to give you the same stimulus as a 140 kilo deadlift. It's just not happening. Doesn't mean it's an exclusively worse exercise, but on raw stimulus alone, not as good. So this one's kind of variable, depends on your level of training. After that, we've got the pump and the burn. These are technically different things, but they usually go hand in hand, so we can assess them together. I'd say this is pretty good. This is a pretty good exercise for getting a pump and a burn, mostly due to the range of motion and sort of the distance your foot travels when you do this. And the fact that it's well suited to high reps. That's something we haven't mentioned much before, but strength exercises are typically exercises better suited to lower reps. You can lift more weight, just makes sense. Hypertrophy exercises have a much broader range of reps. And particularly for a pump and burn, higher reps almost always are the way to go. And if an exercise is, you know, doesn't have very good overload and doesn't have very good progression potential, that means it's not very heavy and it will never be very heavy. One saving grace of that is that it might actually still be really good for high reps, sets of like 20 to 30. And in that case, cable kickbacks actually do quite well. The last thing we want to look at is fatigue. And again, you'll notice, you know, most people, and I'll be real, most ladies are doing cable kickbacks to grow their glutes. They're doing it for hypertrophy. So far, they're going pretty good for hypertrophy. The last one is fatigue. Their fatigue rating is really, really good. You know, you can do like 5 hard sets of cable kickbacks and you're not going to be that tired, mostly because the overload is not very high, the raw stimulus is not very high. You know, those are all negative factors, but at least you get the benefit that they're not that tiring. You could do these, and then you could even do some more glute training afterwards, use these as a pre-exhaust, and you'd be pretty fine doing that. So overall for hypertrophy, as long as you're using them appropriately, you know, I would not make cable kickbacks your main glute exercise, but if you're using them appropriately, they're pretty good. Okay, next up we got athleticism. So, this one's probably not going to be very good. First feature in athleticism is the speed that the exercise allows you to achieve, in a sense. Part of that is the speed that you can do the exercise with. So if you can do like a cable kickback really fast, that's not really a good idea though. You're going to be yanking the cables around, it's going to bounce weirdly. You probably wouldn't break the cable because the weight's not very heavy, but it's just going to be very uncomfortable to do. So in that capacity, you can't do the exercise quickly, therefore it's not allowing you to practice moving with speed. It's not going to be the best for generating speed. Now, the glutes themselves are an important muscle in speed and power production for almost every athletic movement, but because this is not that good of a speed exercise by itself, not very good for that. Similarly with power, when you're assessing power, it really is just strength and speed combined. That's by far the most important factors for power production. Again, these are not a very good strength exercise, and they're not a very good speed exercise, so they're not a very good power exercise. No matter how you try and do them, I guess maybe if you tried to do them with bands, but there's just so many better options. Don't use these as a power exercise. Next up, in athleticism, you want to consider the agility. Now, this is kind of a complex topic, so I'm going to try and simplify it a bit. I would mostly describe agility as power plus complex multi-directional movement. So stepping in different directions, side to side, forwards and backwards, diagonally, up and down, as many different directions as you can move, and maybe switching between different movements, and doing that with power behind it. That's mostly what agility is about. These are not very good for that. You're really only moving in one direction. You're just doing the kickback over and over again, and there's not much power involved. Not a great agility exercise. Lastly, we've got their carryover to sports. This is a really broad topic because there's a lot of different sports. I don't see these having carryover to many sports outside of maybe, honestly, maybe like dancing. I could see some poses in dancing where you do something like this. Like sports karate or taekwondo, when you're doing like a spinning back kick, it's kind of a similar movement. I might sound like I'm joking about that, but I do think that there could be a place for this exercise in your routine if those are sports that you do. But overall, most popular sports, basketball, football, volleyball, netball, golf, this is not going to do very much for those. So next up, we want to look at mobility and rehab. So we talked about range of motion in the hypertrophy section, but range of motion also factors into mobility and rehab, but I've specified here it's range of motion beyond normal exercises. If it has a decent range of motion already, my favorite example just being a full range arse to grass squat, that's good for mobility. For me, that's just the normal standard. You just should be going arse to grass. For a lot of people, unfortunately, that's not their normal standard. But mobility, if it goes even beyond something like that, then it's probably going to be very good for mobility. When it comes to the cable kickback, like I said in the hypertrophy section, it does have really good range of motion. And a lot of glute exercises don't have the best range of motion. Like deadlifts, sumo squats, hip thrusts. They're really good in the loading capacity, but sometimes you don't get the best stretch. Maybe you don't get the best contraction. Maybe you get one or the other, but not both. With cable kickbacks, you can get a really good stretch and a really good contraction. And in a sense, the fact that they're not as good for overloading is not really a problem here, because the next thing we want to look at is their regression potential. So we talked about in strength progression potential, how much heavier it can get over time. Regression potential is how much easier you can make an exercise, because if someone has an injury or they just have really bad mobility, they might not be able to do the basic version of it. Because cable kickbacks use your leg, and especially your glute, very strong muscle in general, and most cable machines, when you put just one plate on there, it's really, really light. It might be like 2.5 kilos or 5 kilos or something. Basically, everyone can do that. Like small children could probably do that. So the regression potential of cable kickbacks is pretty fantastic. Next up, we have an opposite to the strength section again, which is instability as a positive. Because often if someone has mobility problems or an injury and they need to rehab, there's probably some instability going on there that they need to address. And so putting in some exercises that are a little bit unstable can help improve that. But I've got it written here. It's important to note too much instability is still a negative. You know, if someone's got a knee injury or something and you have them doing like, I don't know, one-legged squats on a Bosu ball, the chance they fall off and fuck up their knee again is relatively high. Whereas the benefit of doing that is, you know, does not match the risk associated. So too much instability, still a problem, but some instability, really good for mobility and rehab. And like I said earlier, cable kickbacks, they do have a bit of instability, especially if you don't hold on to something and brace. I would recommend you do hold on to something and brace to do them effectively, but still, these are just unstable enough that they might benefit you if you need to train some stability. If you need to improve mobility in your glutes, you know, you could also say if you need to improve mobility in your general hip region, then kickbacks are probably going to help with that because they're so specific to the glutes. When you do a kickback, you know what it's for, you know what it's working. If you know just a little bit about how muscles work, you could identify that quite quickly. So this one's pretty well targeted at its intended area, good range of motion for that area, gets good points here. And lastly, for mobility and rehab, something I think people forget. You know, I know a lot of physios, I work closely with a lot of physios. Even they sometimes miss this part, although it's probably more that their clients don't do this part and then they just assume they're not going to, unfortunately. Progression into one of the other qualities is important because frankly, like, no one cares how mobile you are, no one cares how well you've fixed your injury. What matters is what comes after that. You know, you could have the world's healthiest knees, and if you can't do anything with them, it kind of doesn't matter, you know? So you want to be able to progress the exercise from just a mobility and rehab exercise into a different type of exercise. If you can't do that, it is fine just to use it for mobility and rehab, but the best mobility and rehab exercises can become strength exercises or bodybuilding exercises or whatever. For cable kickbacks, they kind of fit this. Like I said before, they're decent for hypertrophy, so they can progress into another quality. Next up, we have cardio. You know, a lot of exercise assessments I do, I'm probably going to say the cardio aspect is not very good because my general opinion is if you want to do cardio, you should just be doing cardio. You shouldn't be trying to make an exercise into cardio. First important factor for cardio is the heart rate and breathing increase. That's basically what cardiovascular health is the health of your heart and your lungs and your vascular system and whatnot. When you do cable kickbacks, doesn't train that much of your body, it's not that hard, your heart rate isn't going to go up much, your breathing isn't going to go up much. If you get out of breath doing cable kickbacks, you've got some issues there. So next up, there's sustainability over time, and that time can be for seconds, it can be for minutes, and it can be for hours. Because when we're talking about like endurance cardio, that's hours. When we're talking about sort of more high intensity interval training type stuff, if that's the kind of cardio you like, that's more seconds or minutes. You know, you can sprint for 10 seconds, you can do a hard dash maybe for a couple minutes. You know, so all of these things count as cardio. I would say kickbacks, they are sustainable over a period of a minute or more, but that's mostly because they're not hard on your cardiovascular system. So I guess the sustainability works okay in that capacity, but yeah, this is not very relevant. Next up, you want to look at if it's an anaerobic or aerobic exercise. What that basically means is it more like a hard, powerful sprint and or weightlifting, or aerobic being something that you can do over an extended period of time just by breathing. We won't get into the too deep details about the differences between these. Interestingly, kickbacks, as easy as they are, could almost be done as an aerobic exercise, but then they would be so easy that they're not giving you the muscular benefits and strength benefits. So you'd want to do them as an anaerobic exercise, but they would not be a good option for anaerobic cardio because they're nothing like sprinting. Similar to that, you want to check whether it is an effective high intensity interval training or low intensity steady state cardio option. Again, like I said before, kickbacks, not good for either of these. And the last factor in cardio, although this applies to almost all of these other qualities as well, is the likelihood of repetitive strain injuries. Because when you do cardio, you're going to be doing this thing over and over again, maybe for hours at a time. If it causes injury by doing that, not a good cardio option. I don't think anyone's getting repetitive strain injuries from doing kickbacks, so that's fine. But you know, these other factors, they're just not a good cardio exercise. So lastly, in the other category, the three I have written down here, although there could be others, is accessibility, injury risk, and personal enjoyment factor. The accessibility of cable kickbacks is very, very high. If your gym does not have a cable machine, go to a better gym. They might not have the ankle attachment thing, you know, the little cuff, but you can buy those pretty cheap. So accessibility is quite good. Injury risk, very, very low. I really can't imagine how you would hurt yourself doing these unless you were doing some really dumb, heavy cheat reps. Maybe you could like round your back a little, and I don't know. Yeah, the injury risk on these is very, very low. So that's great. And lastly, the personal enjoyment factor. You know, I see girls doing these all the time, and you know, year in and year out, their glutes don't seem to grow very much. So I can only assume that they're doing it because they just enjoy doing it. Otherwise, they'd probably do something more effective. That sounds like I'm hating on the exercise a lot. I'm not. Like I said, they have their place in hypertrophy, but this should not be the only exercise you do to grow your glutes. It should not even be one of the main ones. If I had to give a description for the best use of the cable kickback, it is that if you have trouble activating your glutes, they can help with that because you squeeze them a lot. As you do the movement, you can really feel the contraction quite well, which can, you know, if you have trouble activating them, that can teach you to activate them. But as a primary muscle builder, even though they get an okay stretch, the load is not quite adequate, the raw stimulus is not quite adequate, and unfortunately, often in the stretched position, the load is the least. So you're not getting a really good stretch under load, which is very important. So if you're at the stage in your training where you have trouble feeling your glutes and they're not that developed yet, throw in some kickbacks as a pre-exhaust to maybe some hip thrusts or squats or something. They'll work quite well. If you're somewhat more advanced, relatively strong, relatively well-developed glutes, this is maybe kind of a, you know, C-tier accessory that you throw in here and there.